I was repainting the baseboards in my grandmother's back hallway when my brother called. Not texted, called. Which should have been my first sign that something was wrong. Because my brother hadn't voluntarily called me in almost 2 years. We communicated in the way that estranged siblings do. The occasional holiday group text, the liked Instagram photo that meant nothing, the polite hug at Thanksgiving that lasted exactly 1 second too short. So when his name lit up my phone screen on a Tuesday afternoon in October, I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, and I'm also not. Let me back up. My grandmother's name is Edith, and she is 81 years old and sharper than anyone gives her credit for. She lives in the same house she's lived in since 1974, a pale yellow colonial in western Pennsylvania with a wraparound porch and a garden that gets more ambitious every spring, despite her arthritic hands. My grandfather built most of that porch himself. He passed 11 years ago, and my grandmother has managed everything since then with a quiet, stubborn competence that I have always admired and that my brother has always, I think, resented. My grandmother is also, it turns out, worth considerably more than anyone in our family realized. Not in a flashy way. She never drove a new car or wore expensive jewelry. But the house was paid off in 1989, and she'd been renting the 2-acre lot behind it to a local farmer for decades. She had a modest investment account that her financial advisor, a patient, careful man named Howard, who had been her advisor since the 1980s, had managed conservatively and well. And there was the life insurance policy from my grandfather, which had been quietly compounding in a secondary account for over a decade before anyone thought to ask about it. I found out about all of this 3 years ago when my grandmother asked me to start helping her with her finances. She didn't ask my brother, she asked me. I want to be clear about why, because I think it matters. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a paralegal at a small estate law firm in Pittsburgh, and I'd been doing that work for 6 years. I understand wills and trusts and account structures the way you understand a language you've spoken long enough that you stop thinking about the grammar. My brother is a contractor. He's good at what he does, but numbers make him impatient, and impatient people make mistakes with other people's money, and my grandmother knew that, so she asked me. I started coming over on Saturday mornings. We'd sit at her kitchen table with her folders and her reading glasses and her cup of instant coffee that she insisted on making herself, and I'd go through her statements with her. I set up online access for her accounts. I helped her update her beneficiary designations. I walked her through what she had, what it meant, what it was for. What it was for, she told me very plainly, was her grandchildren. Both of us. Equally. I'm not leaving this earth with anything unspoken, she said once, spreading her hands flat on the table like she was smoothing out a wrinkle. Your grandfather and I worked for this. I wanted to go somewhere it matters. I told her that was more than generous. She waved me off. My brother knew she had money. He didn't know how much, and I never told him, because it wasn't my information to share. But he'd made comments over the years. At Christmas, at her birthday dinners. Little jokes that weren't quite jokes. Grandma Edith sitting on a gold mine over there. That kind of thing. Said with a laugh, but with something underneath the laugh that I noticed and then tried to unnotice. He visited her maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always with his wife, always for less than 2 hours, always leaving with whatever she'd baked for them wrapped carefully in foil. He was never unkind to her. He was just present enough to stay in the story, if that makes sense. Present enough to matter at the end. Which brings me to the October Tuesday and the phone call I almost didn't answer. Hey, he said when I picked up. Casual. A little too casual. How's Grandma doing? I set down my paintbrush. She's good. We had lunch last Sunday. Why? No reason. I've just been thinking about her lately. A pause. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. About her situation. Her situation. You know what I mean. Her finances. Her estate. He cleared his throat. I've been talking to someone. A real estate developer. And I think we might be able to do something really good for her if we act soon. I did not say anything for a moment. Outside, through my grandmother's kitchen window, I could see the old oak tree in the backyard starting to turn. My grandmother loved that tree. She'd hung the bird feeder from its lowest branch every winter for as long as I could remember. What kind of something? I said. He explained it quickly. The way people explain things they've thought about long enough that they've stopped seeing the problems. A developer was interested in the property, the house and the lot behind it. The market was good right now, exceptional actually, and the offer they were willing to make was substantial. More than my grandmother could reasonably use in the rest of her lifetime. She could move somewhere nice, somewhere with support staff and activities. He'd already looked at a few places. He had a brochure. She doesn't want to move, I said. She doesn't know what's possible yet. She's 81 years old, and she's lived in that house for 50 years. She's not moving. Addie. That's what he calls me. Addie, short for Adelaide, which is my name. He uses it the way people use a name when they want to remind you of something. Your age, your place, your relationship to them. I'm not asking you to make the decision. I'm asking you to be open-minded, to think about what's actually best for her. I told him I'd think about it. I hung up and sat very still for a while. Then I called Howard. Howard told me what I had already suspected. My brother had called him 2 weeks prior. He'd introduced himself as a family member and asked general questions about my grandmother's accounts. The kind of questions that sound innocent until you understand what they're mapping. Howard, to his credit, had given him nothing specific, but he'd confirmed that yes, he managed accounts for my grandmother. Yes, she had multiple assets. He'd been polite, and my brother had apparently been satisfied. I wanted to call you after, Howard said, but I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into it. You weren't, I said. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't drink and thought about my brother, about the way he'd said, act soon, about the developer he'd been talking to and how long that conversation must have been going on before he called me, about the brochures he'd already pulled together for assisted living facilities that my grandmother had not asked to see. I thought about what I knew, professionally, about how these situations unfold, how the story usually goes. A family member with proximity to an elderly relative, a financial opportunity, a plan that gets presented as being for them, and then, later, paperwork, signatures. Decisions made quickly, explained slowly, understood too late. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table with her instant coffee and her hands spread flat and her voice saying I wanted to go somewhere it matters. I was not going to let this happen. Here's what I did, and I want to be precise about it, because the precision is the point. The first thing I did was talk to my grandmother. Not about my brother's plan, not yet. I asked her if she'd spoken to him recently. She said he'd called a few weeks ago, which was unusual enough that she'd mentioned it to her neighbor. He'd been chatty, she said, asked a lot of questions about the house, about whether it was getting to be too much for her. She'd thought he was being thoughtful. I kept my face very still. The second thing I did was talk to the attorney at my firm who specializes in elder law. Her name is Suzanne, and she is not a person who wastes words. I told her what I knew. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Does your grandmother have a durable power of attorney in place?" She did. It named me. "Good," Suzanne said. "Now let's make sure everything else is where it needs to be." Over the following 2 weeks, Suzanne and I went through my grandmother's estate documents carefully. We updated her advance directive. We reviewed the trust structure. She had a revocable living trust that had been set up years ago but hadn't been fully funded, meaning some of her assets weren't actually in it the way they should have been. We fixed that. We made sure the house was correctly titled within the trust. We documented everything. My grandmother was present for all of it. She asked good questions. She signed things deliberately, reading each page before she put her name to it. At one point, she looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "You know, I always thought you'd make a good attorney." "I'm not an attorney," I said. "You could be." She looked back down at the page. "Your grandfather would have liked watching you do this." I had to look out the window for a moment before I could answer her. The third thing I did was wait. My brother called again in November. His tone had shifted slightly, less casual now, a little more structured, like he'd been rehearsing. He told me he'd had more conversations with the developer. The offer had a timeline. If my grandmother was going to benefit from the current market, she needed to make a decision within the next 30 days. "I think we should sit down with her together," he said. "As a family, present the full picture." "Sure," I said. "Let's do that." He sounded surprised that I agreed so easily. We scheduled it for the following Saturday. He was going to bring his wife. He was going to bring the developer's formal offer letter. I called my grandmother afterward and told her exactly what was coming. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see." 2 words. The flattest 2 words I had ever heard her say. I had heard her cry exactly once at my grandfather's funeral. I had heard her angry exactly twice. Once when a contractor tried to overcharge her for a roof repair, and once when my cousin said something dismissive about her cooking at a family dinner. But I had never heard her sound the way she sounded in that moment, contained and very cold, and already thinking several steps ahead. "I'll put on a nice pot of coffee," she said. "Let him make his presentation." Saturday arrived. My brother came with his wife and a folder of printed documents and an expression of careful, practiced warmth. He kissed my grandmother on the cheek. He complimented her house, which felt, under the circumstances, like a specific kind of cruelty. His wife brought flowers. We sat in the living room, which my grandmother had set up with tea and the good cups, the one she only brought out for occasions she considered important. She sat in her usual chair. She was wearing her better cardigan. Her hands were folded in her lap. My brother opened his folder. He had been thorough, I'll give him that. He had the offer letter, which was for a real number from a real developer. He had printed materials about 3 different assisted living communities, with the monthly costs highlighted. He had a rough calculation of what the proceeds from the sale would cover after taxes. He'd thought about this. He prepared. He talked for about 15 minutes. He was careful to frame everything around her comfort, her security, her quality of life, and her remaining years. He did not once acknowledge that she had never expressed any desire to leave. He did not once ask what she wanted. He presented the full picture, as promised, and the full picture was a version of her life that he had decided was appropriate. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. My grandmother took a slow sip of her tea. "I appreciate that you've been thinking about me," she said. "I do, but I'm going to need you to understand something." She set her cup down very precisely in its saucer. "This house is in my trust. It has been properly titled for several weeks now, with my attorney's guidance and Adelaide's help. The trust terms as I have written them do not allow for the sale of this property without my express written consent, which I will not be giving. My financial accounts are similarly structured." She looked at him steadily. "If someone were to attempt to move forward with any sale or asset transfer without those protections in place, they would find it, legally speaking, quite impossible." My brother's expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise first, then something sharper, which he tried to cover. Then a look at me. "You knew about this," he said. "I helped with it," I said. "When did you?" "A while ago." I kept my voice even. "We wanted to make sure everything was in order." His wife was looking at the flowers she'd brought, which were sitting in a vase on the side table. Nobody said anything for a moment. "I'm not trying to take anything from anyone," he said finally to my grandmother. He'd switched to a different tone now, quieter, a little wounded. "I genuinely thought this was a good opportunity for you." "I know you did," my grandmother said. And the thing that got me, the thing I still think about, is that she didn't sound bitter when she said it. She sounded tired and sad and entirely certain of what she was doing. "But this is my home. Your grandfather put this porch on with his own hands. I'm going to die in this house, and I'm going to do it on my own schedule." She picked up her tea again. "Now, would anyone like more?" He didn't stay long after that. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices, just the slow deflation of a plan that had run into something solid and unmovable. He and his wife left with their folder and their highlighted calculations and the flowers, which his wife offered to take back, but which my grandmother told her to leave. He didn't call me for 3 weeks. When he did, it was shorter than I expected. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he could see now how it might have looked. He did not apologize exactly, but he said the word sorry somewhere in the middle of a longer sentence, folded into qualifications, and I decided to accept it for what it was. "I need you to understand something," I said, when he was done. "I will always be on her side. Whatever you're planning, whatever opportunity comes up, I will always be the person who makes sure she's protected. That's not going to change." A long pause. "I know," he said. "I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my brother. I think some fractures change shape when you press on them. They don't disappear, but they settle into something you can work around if both people decide to try. I don't know yet if he's decided that. I'm not sure I have either. What I know is this. My grandmother's house is still pale yellow. The bird feeder is back on the oak tree. Last Sunday, I helped her plant tulip bulbs in the front garden. The two of us kneeling in the cold dirt with our hands in gloves, tucking them in one by one. She told me about the year she and my grandfather planted 400 bulbs in one afternoon, and how her back hurt for a week, and how they laughed about it every spring when the flowers came up. "You'll see them in April," she told me, pressing the last bulb into the earth and patting the soil over it firmly, like a period at the end of a sentence, like something she was certain of. I want to believe her. I think I do. Some things are worth protecting before anyone tries to take them. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is act quietly and early, and without waiting for the problem to announce itself. The paperwork isn't romantic. The legal language isn't warm, but there's a different kind of warmth in sitting across from someone you love at a kitchen table and making sure that what they've built stays exactly where they put it. I drove home that Sunday with dirt under my fingernails and thought about my grandfather's porch and the weight of things that are built to last. April is coming. The tulips will be there. So will I. I've thought a lot about what my brother actually believed when he walked into my grandmother's living room that Saturday with his folder and his highlighted numbers and his carefully chosen words. I don't think he saw himself as someone doing something wrong. That's the part that took me a long time to sit with. The fact that the most damaging things people do to each other are usually wrapped in a story that makes complete sense to the person telling it. He had convinced himself he was being practical, thoughtful even, and that self-conviction is exactly what made him dangerous. What he didn't account for was that Edith had spent 81 years learning how to read a room. She knew what he was doing before he finished his first sentence. She just let him finish anyway because she'd already decided what she was going to say, and she wanted him to hear it clearly. That's something I've been turning over ever since. The difference between reacting and responding. My first instinct, when I understood what my brother was planning, was to call him immediately, to confront it head on, to make it loud and visible. But I didn't. I called Howard. I called Suzanne. I sat at my kitchen table and thought carefully about what the actual problem was and what the actual solution looked like, not what would feel satisfying in the moment, what would actually work. That restraint didn't come naturally to me. I had to choose it. And I think that choice, to act quietly, deliberately, without tipping my hand, is what made everything else possible. If I'd called my brother in anger, he would have adjusted his approach. He would have worked around me. Instead, by the time he sat down across from my grandmother with his offer letter, everything was already settled. The house was titled correctly. The trust was funded. The paperwork was done. There was nothing left for him to threaten, because there was nothing left for him to threaten. Because there was nothing left unprotected. The preparation mattered more than the confrontation. It almost always does. I've also thought about what it means to be someone people trust with the things that matter most to them. My grandmother didn't choose me because I was the older one, or the louder one, or the one who showed up more. She chose me because she'd watched how I handled information, carefully, without ego, without using it for myself. That kind of trust is built slowly and can be lost fast, and I don't take it lightly. When she spread her hands flat on that kitchen table and told me she wanted her life's work to go somewhere it mattered, she was handing me something. I understood that. I hope I always will. There's a version of this story where I did nothing, where I thought it probably wouldn't go anywhere, or that it wasn't really my place to intervene, or that maybe my brother had a point. I understand how people end up in that version. It's easier. It asks less of you. But easy isn't the same as right, and quiet isn't the same as safe. And the people who depend on us don't always have the energy or the knowledge to protect themselves from the people who are supposed to love them. April is a few months away. The tulip bulbs are in the ground. Edith will be in her garden when they come up, in the house her husband built, on the porch he put there with his own hands. That's what the paperwork was for. That's what all of it was for.